Every victory has a price, and Cadsuane's war against tradition and madness came with a cost that would shake the White Tower and the Dragon Reborn's camp to their core. She had saved Rand al'Thor from his madness, she had shattered the White Tower's rigid hierarchy of age and strength, and she had forced the Aes Sedai to confront their own complacency and their own failure to do their duty. She had won victories that no other Aes Sedai could have won, victories that had saved the world from the shadow, but those victories did not come for free. The collateral damage of Cadsuane's progress was extensive. It included the loss of trust between Rand's camp and the White Tower, the alienation of potential allies, and a dangerous reliance on her personal authority rather than a sustainable system of governance within the White Tower. And it raised a devastating question, a question that would haunt the Aes Sedai and the people of the world for years to come. Does the survival of the world justify the permanent destabilization of the Aes Sedai as a unified political force? The first and most damaging piece of collateral damage was the loss of trust between Rand al'Thor's camp and the White Tower. Rand's allies, his friends, his lovers, and the nations that had pledged their support to him had never fully trusted the White Tower. They had seen the Aes Sedai's political infighting, their desire to control Rand, and their history of manipulating kings and queens for their own gain. But they had been willing to work with the White Tower because they knew that the Aes Sedai's power was necessary to win the war against the Shadow. Cadsuane's methods, however, destroyed what little trust there was. Her brutal psychological warfare against Rand, her open defiance of the White Tower's authority, and her willingness to act independently of the Tower's leadership made Rand's camp see the White Tower not as an ally but as a threat. They believed that Cadsuane's actions were the White Tower's actions, that she was acting on the Tower's behalf, and that the Aes Sedai still wanted to control Rand and use him for their own gain. They did not see that Cadsuane was acting against the White Tower's wishes, that she was a rebel within the institution, and that she was fighting to save Rand, not to control him. All they saw was an Aes Sedai who had treated the Dragon Reborn with cruelty, an Aes Sedai who had broken the Tower's rules, and an Aes Sedai who seemed to have unlimited power within the White Tower. This loss of trust created a rift between Rand's camp and the White Tower, a rift that made it harder for them to work together, a rift that led to misunderstandings and arguments, and a rift that almost cost them the war. Rand's friends like Perrin Ibarra and Mac Hawthorne refused to work with any Aes Sedai. They believed that all Aes Sedai were like Cadsuane, cruel and manipulative, and they did not want them anywhere near Rand. The Ale clans, who had sworn to protect the Dragon Reborn, were suspicious of the White Tower. They had a long history of conflict with the Aes Sedai, and Cadsuane's actions only reinforced their distrust. The kings and queens of the world who had pledged their support to Rand began to question their alliance with the White Tower. They feared that the Aes Sedai would turn on them once the war was over, and that they would be nothing more than puppets for the Tower's gain. This loss of trust was not just a political problem, it was a military one. The war against the Shadow required unity. It required the Dragon Reborn's camp and the White Tower to work together, to combine their power, their resources, and their armies. But the rift created by Cadsuane's methods made that unity impossible. The Aes Sedai were left to fight their own battles. Rand's camp was left to fight theirs, and the Shadow was able to exploit this division to gain ground and to push closer to victory. Cadsuane's methods also alienated potential allies for the White Tower and for Rand. There were many nations, many groups, and many individuals who were on the fence about joining the fight against the Shadow, who were unsure if they wanted to align themselves with the Dragon Reborn or the White Tower. Cadsuane's actions made their decision easy. They chose to stay neutral. They chose to not get involved because they did not want to be associated with a cruel and manipulative Aes Sedai, or a White Tower that seemed to be falling apart. The Shonchan, for example, a powerful nation with a vast army and a hatred of the Aes Sedai, might have been willing to negotiate an alliance with Rand and the White Tower if it meant defeating the Shadow. But Cadsuane's brutal treatment of Rand and her open defiance of the White Tower's rules made the Shonchan see the Aes Sedai as even more dangerous than they already did, and they refused to work with them. The warders, the elite warriors who swore their lives to the Aes Sedai, also became alienated. Many warders saw Cadsuane's actions as a betrayal of the Aes Sedai's values. They believed that she was putting her own agenda above the safety of the tower and the warders who served it. Some warders even left the White Tower. They refused to serve an institution that allowed a woman like Cadsuane to act with such impunity, and this loss of warders weakened the Aes Sedai's military strength significantly. The alienation of these potential allies was a huge blow to the war effort. It meant that Rand and the White Tower had fewer soldiers, fewer resources, and fewer allies to fight the Shadow, and it made the war much harder than it ever needed to be. Another devastating piece of collateral damage was the White Tower's dangerous reliance on Cadsuane's personal authority, rather than a sustainable system of governance. Cadsuane's shattering of the hierarchy of age and strength had left the White Tower in a state of chaos. The Amelin seat and the Hall of the Tower had lost much of their authority, and the Sisters of the Tower were divided between those who supported Cadsuane and those who opposed her. In this chaos, Cadsuane's personal authority became the only thing holding the White Tower together. She was the only one who could make decisions, the only one who could unite the warring factions, and the only one who could force the Aes Sedai to act. The Sisters of the White Tower began to rely on her for everything, for leadership, for direction, for decisions, and they forgot how to govern themselves. They forgot how to debate, how to compromise, how to make decisions as a group, and they became dependent on Cadsuane's unshakable will and her iron fist. This reliance on personal authority was unsustainable because Cadsuane was only one person. She could not be everywhere, she could not make every decision, and she could not lead the White Tower forever. If something were to happen to her, if she were to die in battle, or if she were to step down, the White Tower would be left without a leader, without direction, and without a way to govern itself. It would fall back into chaos, into infighting, into the same political games that had plagued it for centuries, and it would be unable to fight the Shadow. This reliance on personal authority also meant that the White Tower was not able to build a sustainable system of governance, a system that would allow it to function without a single strong leader. Cadsuane had torn down the old hierarchy, but she had not built a new one. She had destroyed the old system, but she had not replaced it with anything better. She was so focused on winning the war, on saving Rand, on fighting the Shadow, that she did not take the time to rebuild the White Tower's infrastructure, to create a new ranking system, to establish new rules and protocols that would allow the tower to function, and this failure to build a new system meant that the White Tower's destabilization was permanent. Even after the war was over, even after the Shadow was defeated, the White Tower would remain divided, it would remain weak, and it would remain unable to function as a unified political force. This permanent destabilization of the Aes Sedai raises the most important question of all. Does the survival of the world justify it? Cadsuane's actions saved the world. She saved Rand al'Thor from his madness. She forced the Aes Sedai to act, and she helped to defeat the Shadow. Without her, the world would have fallen to the Dark One, and everything would have been lost. But the cost of that survival was the permanent destabilization of the Aes Sedai, a unified political force that had protected the world for 3,000 years. The Aes Sedai were no longer able to act as a single unit. They were no longer able to enforce peace. They were no longer able to protect the world from the Shadow in the way that they once had. And this meant that the world was more vulnerable than it had ever been, more vulnerable to new threats, more vulnerable to the Shadow's return, more vulnerable to chaos and destruction. Was that cost worth it? Was the survival of the world worth the loss of a unified White Tower, the loss of trust between allies, the alienation of potential friends, and the dangerous reliance on a single person's authority? Cadsuane would argue that it was that the survival of the world is the only thing that matters, that all other costs are secondary. And she would be right in the moment, in the heat of the war, in the face of the apocalypse. The survival of the world is the only thing that matters. But the long-term consequences of that decision are far-reaching. They are consequences that the world would have to live with for generations to come. The collateral damage of Cadsuane's progress is real, it is painful, and it is permanent. And it is a reminder that every victory comes with a price that we must be willing to pay, but a price that we must also acknowledge and understand. Cadsuane Melaidhrin saved the world, but she left it a more vulnerable place. A place where the White Tower is broken, a place where allies are divided, a place where progress has come at a terrible cost. And it is up to the people of the world, up to the Aes Sedai, and up to the next generation to repair the damage, to rebuild the White Tower, and to create a new future, a future where progress does not have to come with such a heavy price. The last battle ended the Shadow's threat to the world, but it left behind a White Tower that would never be the same, a world that was forever changed, and a legacy of fractured authority that was all the work of Cadsuane. For 3,000 years, the White Tower had stood as a symbol of unity, a beacon of light, and the ultimate authority on all things related to the One Power and the Shadow. Its ancient prestige was unrivaled, its hierarchy was unshakable, and its Aes Sedai were respected and feared across the world. But the last battle changed all of that. Cadsuane's actions during the war against the Shadow tore down the White Tower's ancient hierarchy, shattered its rigid rules, and left its authority fractured beyond repair. The White Tower that emerged from the last battle was not the same institution that had existed for 3 millennia. It was a broken, a divided and a weakened tower, a tower that was struggling to find its place in a new world, a world that no longer needed the old ways, the old rules, and the old authority. And yet this broken tower, this fractured authority was exactly what the world needed, because it was the foundation of a new era. An era that could no longer hide behind the veil of ancient protocol. An era that demanded courage, action, and change. Cadsuane's legacy is the legacy of that change. A legacy of a woman who broke the world to save it, a woman who tore down an ancient institution to rebuild it, and a woman who became the ultimate irony of the White Tower. A tradition breaker sitting at the head of a broken institution as the alienation. To understand Cadsuane's legacy of fractured authority, you have to first understand the post-last battle landscape. A landscape that was defined by loss, by change, and by uncertainty. The last battle had cost the world dearly. Millions of lives had been lost, cities had been destroyed, and nations had been broken. The Dragon Reborn Rand al'Thor had defeated the Dark One and saved the world, but he had vanished shortly after the battle, leaving the world without its savior and without a clear direction. The nations of the world were struggling to rebuild. They were fighting over resources, over land, and over power. And they were looking for leadership, for stability, for a force that could unite them and guide them into the future. For 3,000 years, that force had been the White Tower, but the White Tower was no longer able to fill that role. Its authority was fractured, its ranks were divided, and its ability to act as a unified political force was all but gone. The old hierarchy of age and strength was gone, replaced by chaos and infighting. The Amelin seat and the Hall of the Tower had lost much of their power, and the Sisters of the Tower were split between those who wanted to return to the old ways and those who wanted to embrace the new change that Cadsuane had brought. This fractured authority was not an accident. It was the direct result of Cadsuane's actions during the war. She had shattered the White Tower's hierarchy, she had defied its authority, she had treated its most senior sisters like children, and she had forced the tower to confront its own failures. She had done all of this to save the world, to save Rand al'Thor, but she had not stopped to consider the long-term consequences of her actions. She had torn down the old system, but she had not built a new one. She had destroyed the old authority, but she had not established a new one. And this left the White Tower in a state of limbo, a state of fractured authority that would define it for years to come. But this fractured authority was not just a weakness, it was a strength. Because the old White Tower, the tower of ancient protocol, rigid hierarchy, and political infighting, was not capable of leading the world into a new era. It was a tower that was stuck in the past, a tower that was unable to adapt to change, a tower that was more focused on its own internal politics than on the needs of the world. The fractured authority of the post-last battle White Tower meant that the old ways were gone, that the old rules no longer applied, and that the Aes Sedai were forced to adapt to the new world. It meant that younger sisters were able to rise to positions of power based on their ability, not their age, that weaker sisters were able to make a difference based on their character, not their strength, and that the Aes Sedai were forced to work together to rebuild their tower and to help rebuild the world. The fractured authority was a blank slate, a chance for the White Tower to reinvent itself, to create a new identity, a new system. and a new authority that was based on duty, courage, and unity rather than rank, protocol, and age. And the person who was tasked with leading this reinvention was none other than Cadsuane Melaidhrin herself, the tradition breaker, the rebel, the woman who had shattered the White Tower's authority in the first place. Cadsuane's ascension to the Amelin seat is the final and greatest irony of her legacy. She was a woman who had spent her entire life defying the White Tower's authority, who had torn down its hierarchy, who had mocked its rules, and who had been seen as a rebel by the Tower's most senior sisters. And yet, she was the one who was chosen to be the Amelin seat, the leader of the White Tower, the ultimate authority of the institution she had spent her life fighting against. This ascension was not a surprise to those who knew her. It was a necessity. She was the only one who could bring the warring factions together, the only one who could make the sisters put aside their differences, and the only one who could lead the White Tower into the new era. The sisters of the White Tower may have hated her, they may have feared her, and they may have disagreed with her methods, but they respected her. They respected her strength, her wisdom, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to fighting the shadow. And they knew that she was the only one who could rebuild the White Tower and restore its authority. Cadsuane's time as a Merlin seat was defined by her commitment to change, by her refusal to return to the old ways, and by her determination to build a new White Tower, a tower that was based